And so this brings us now to the time when the Apostle Paul, he left Ephesus after his 3 years or so there. And he, first of all, we read, he travelled to Troas, waiting to see Titus. And so it seemed that the arrangement was Titus would take the severe letter to Corinth and then would meet Paul at Troas. And Paul was eager to know how that letter had been received. Let's see what he says. Chapter 2, verse 12. That's what I'm looking for. When I came to Troas to proclaim the good news of Christ, the door was opened to me in the Lord, but my mind could not rest because I did not find my brother Titus there. So it would seem they had an arrangement to meet at Troas, but Titus wasn't there. And even though there was fabulous opportunities for ministry, the Apostle Paul was so concerned about the result of this severe letter that he couldn't set his mind on it. And so he said farewell to them and he went on to Macedonia. We don't know where, possibly Philippi, as that was a real key city there. And there in Macedonia he met Titus. And Titus was comforted, and he was comforted by the good news, the fact that the letter had been received. And that is what we find in chapter 7. This sense of relief. You read chapter 7, and what you get as you read it is this massive sense of relief that the letter had been received. And it had done what Paul had wanted it to do. For even, verse 5, for even when we came into Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were afflicted in every way, disputes without and fears within. But God, who consoles the downcast, consoled us by the arrival of Titus, not only by his coming, but also by the consolation with which he was consoled about you, as he told us of your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoice still more. And as you read it, you can just sense this, they got it. They got it. And so it's in this setting, this situation, we find that the Apostle Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians, our 2 Corinthians, was written out of a response from that particular situation. It was written from Macedonia in the response to the news brought by Titus. And as you can see, it expresses his relief and his joy at the success of this letter, that he was in two minds, wishing he hadn't written it, but glad he did write it, because it was, whatever it said, it was really strong. And as we're going to see, it seems that they felt necessary to address accusations that had been made against him. So I'm sure when Timothy came back, Timothy gave a long account of everything that was going on in the church. And as Paul was writing to prepare the church for his visit, because he was in Macedonia, 2 Corinthians, our 2 Corinthians, would have been sent on ahead of him, and then he would have gone there himself. And what he was wanting to do was explain why he had changed his mind, because that had been used against him as an accusation. To defend his ministry. You noticed how he was being put down as an apostle, kind of an extension of what was beginning to happen in 1 Corinthians. Prepare them for the offering. You notice his offering is a big deal. You guys not done Romans yet? Have you done Romans yet? Okay, so comes there again. This offering that the apostle had wanted to take up to show the church's care and love for the saints in Judea in the time of great suffering and hardship that they were having. So a real defense of his ministry, preparing for the offering. But also, not just his ministry, but his role as an apostle was being challenged. And to have the church ready for this third visit. And so he made what we understand to be his third visit. And we read about this in Acts 20. This was AD 55 to 56 to collect the offering. And it was there that he actually wrote the book of Romans. You guys will be studying soon. So I'd like to talk about some unique features of 2 Corinthians. Some of these you may well have noticed. The first is that in chapter 2:13 flows directly into chapter 7 verse 5. Did anybody notice that? Okay, then I want you to notice it. Alright? What I would do is just read 2, 12 and 13 and go straight on and read 7 verse 5. And this is how it reads. When I came to Troas to proclaim the good news of Christ, a door was opened for me in the Lord. But my mind could not rest because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I said farewell to them and went on to Macedonia. For even when we came into Macedonia, our bodies had no rest. And we were afflicted in every way, disputes without and fears within. But God, so on and so forth. And it's as if someone took a pair of scissors, kind of, well actually we don't have to do that, do we? We copy and paste, you know. It's like someone copied and pasted this whole bit of 2:14 through to 7:4 and put it in there. Now, the reason for this would be a digression, which is not unusual. And the Apostle Paul is talking about the challenges here, what was happening, and then he digresses into a fairly lengthy defense of his ministry. But it's interesting to know that, because if you read from 2:13 to 7:5, you can actually get a flow of the history that's going on behind. And it's kind of really nice and clear, the different movements and travel aspects. Okay, so that's one interesting feature. Now, there's a similar feature within that of chapter 6:13 to chapter 7 verse 2. And let me again, I'll read chapter 6, 11, 12, 13 and then straight on into, did anybody notice this? No? Okay. Chapter 6 verse 11. We have spoken frankly to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open to you. There is no restriction in our affections, but only in yours. In return, I speak as to children. Open wide your heart also. Make room in your hearts for us. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We've taken advantage of no one. You see? And again, it flows through. And what you get there is, of course, that appeal because of the accusations against Paul of the way he's been using them, abusing them, and he's defending himself against that. So again, knowing that helps you get the flow, but again you get this digression. A digression about them not being mismatched with unbelievers. And so some have argued that chapters 8 and 9 tend to repeat each other. I don't know if you noticed that. The emphasis on the offering, so maybe we shouldn't be too surprised. And then 10 through 13, I'm sure you've noticed, seems to have a different tone than the rest. The chapters 1 through 9 is joyful and a sense of relief. And chapter 10 is really quite strong against these super apostles and Paul's defense against them. So this is some of the unique aspects. Some people have argued that 2 Corinthians is not one letter, but it's actually lots of letters that have been put together. Some have suggested that the portion we have in chapter 6 about not being mismatched with unbelievers is in fact the very first letter, or part of the very first letter that the apostle ever wrote. The one mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where he says, I wrote to you not to be associated with such people. And some people think that is that letter. Now, if that is the case, you have to ask why it would be put there. You know, why would someone put it together like that? And so I want you to know that if you read around 2 Corinthians, this is one of the things that you've read. Has anybody read this at all? Done any reading around yet? Okay, well, if you read some of the commentaries or dictionaries, this is what you'll read. That's what some people have suggested. As far as I'm aware, there is no evidence in the manuscripts that 2 Corinthians is anything other than what we have. And because of that, my preference, my recommendation is we take it as a letter rather than lots of bits of letters, and we deal with it, because I do believe there's a really good explanation as to why this letter would be the way it is. And that is especially the tone of the first 9 chapters and then the last 4. And that is, when Paul was writing this letter, he had Titus come to him. Titus had said the church on the whole has repented, and they've responded to this letter you've written, and Paul is filled with relief and gratitude, and he's writing to prepare them for the visit, the third visit, but he's aware that there's still those teachers who would want to undermine him. Just think for a few moments, if you were a false teacher. Can you imagine you're a false teacher? Of course, that's right, yes. You don't think of yourself that way. But if you were going to go into a church that the Apostle Paul had planted and taught, and you had a different teaching than the one he taught, how are you going to get the people in that church to listen to you? Possibly.
He wouldn't just go out and talk to the entire congregation with this new teaching.
Well, possibly. Maybe that's true. But one thing you have to do is undermine the teaching of the apostle. If you are a teacher that has a different teaching than the person who planted the church and was well respected, then unless you can get the church to listen to you, you're not going to get your teaching across. And if they have come out of the Apostle Paul's teaching, you would have to undermine the Apostle Paul. Otherwise, the church won't listen to you. And what you see in especially chapter 10 following is how these false teachers were committed to undermine the credibility of the apostle by all these different things they were saying about him. You know, he is two-faced. One thing when he is with you and a different than when he's away from you. They would compare themselves favourably over against the Apostle Paul. Paul has planted these number of churches, we planted more. You know, Paul has seen 2 people raised from the dead, we've seen 4 people. This comparison. And Paul has never seen Christ alive, but we have. We come from Jerusalem, that is the mother church, and therefore we must have more authority than him. We have done amazing things, more amazing. Something would have to have happened for them to get the Corinthian church to listen to them. And so when you come to the final 4 chapters, you see a different tone, because somehow the Apostle Paul has to get the Corinthian church to realise the emptiness of the boasts of these false apostles, these super apostles, the one that present themselves as being great and more important than the Apostle Paul, better connected. And therefore you can understand why the tone would change. And why there's such an emphasis on boasting. Because they would be boasting about their spirituality, or boasting about their exploits, boasting about the great things they had done. And you see the challenge the apostle has. How does Paul bring the church back to him without going down the same road that they go down? How does he get them back without boasting even more? And basically having the same spirit that they have. The challenge that this Christian leader had is just enormous. And the way he handles it is really remarkable in trying to get them to come back to him. And so there's two groups, a majority and a minority. And the first chapters were written to the majority that had come back to the Apostle Paul. They are the ones who'd responded to the severe letter. And the apostle was really grateful. And in those early chapters, he's writing to them to give an explanation for the accusations that have been made against him, so they would understand why he has done what he's done. And why he teaches what he teaches. And we'll see, he's very clear about that in chapter 5. The second part is written to this group that are still against Paul, but it's a minority. And notice the use of this language. He talks about all, or you all, when he's referring to the majority. And he refers to some when he's referring to the minority. Just as an example, For I am confident about all of you, that my joy would be the joy of you all, for I wrote you out of much distress, etc. So really talking about the majority that had been reconciled to him through the severe letter. But then we come to this second part, and he talks in chapter 10, verse 2. I ask that when I am present, I need to show boldness by daring to oppose those who think we are acting according to human standards. Verse 10, for they say, let such people understand. Chapter 10, verse 12, we do not dare to classify or compare ourselves as some of those who commend themselves, but when they measure themselves, and so on and so forth. So you've got all and you've got the some. And when he's talking about all, he's talking about the majority that have been reconciled to him. But the some is this group that are still opposing him.